If there was a book of life, he thought, or should that be if there were? Anyway, a book of life with neatly printed columns of crisp print running down the middle of spotless, perfectly cut pages. If there were such a thing, where did sound better. His messy little life would be scribbled in the margins in pencil, and the writing would be so rubbed and smudged that it would be all but illegible. His pages, if he had any of his own, would be dog-eared, foxed, and spotted with mysterious stains. Yes, his life was a mysterious, irritating stain on the pages of the Book of Life, a stain that partially obscured the interesting bits, and had faded to a colour so vague as to have no name. A faded stain. How had this happened? How had he become so inconsequential? It may have begun when he became a teenager. Certainly it had been a long, slow, gradual process, the move to secondary school, perhaps. So hard to know when he remembered almost nothing of his young self. The jolt into sudden pressure to be grown up, the struggle with his rebellious, changing body, combined with the new urgent demands made upon him. There had perhaps been a slight slippage at that time, a slippage of soul. He never quite managed to adapt his inner self to his outer as it changed, so that the one could fully inhabit the other. More and more he, his self, felt left adrift, out of step with the burgeoning physical him that was being forced to take its place in the world. The slippage soon became something more, a disconnection, an absence from his immediate surroundings, a feeling of not being entirely in his body. Sometimes, especially during exams at school, to which he could attach no importance at all, he had the sensation of leaving his body and its immediate surroundings altogether. The stale, stuffy air of the exam hall, really the school gym, baked dry by huge Mesozoic cast-iron radiators, the pitiless artificial light produced by long, white, fluorescent tubes which hung flimsily from the high ceiling, combined with the snowy blanks of the sheets of paper that he had been told he must fill over the next 2 hours with useless facts that he had been coerced into learning in order to secure a future he could not see and did not want, all these combined to induce in him a state akin to self-hypnosis. His eyes grew heavy, his head and body followed, his spirit fled the place of torture, and his earthly shell flopped forward to sleep on top of the unanswered questions scattered across his desk. But at these times he was no more asleep in the accepted meaning of the word than he was at night. He was being otherwise. He had gone out. He was travelling. Often he was flying. Not above the rows of desks of hard-pressed boys, not above the gym or over the school, but flying through a glorious abstract space composed entirely of light and colour and air and freedom. All too soon the rude awakening would come. A rap on the knuckles, a slap on the back of the head, and the torture of trying to be present, alert, there, in the material world, would continue. At night, of course, for a few blissful hours he could be truly free, in the so-called land of dreams. But this was the real world. This was where he belonged, where he felt fully alive. Here he flew and glided and drifted, swooped and soared to his heart's content, only coming down to earth again when his body received its morning summons to resume its place in the daytime world of things and tests, demands and expectations. Later, as his body developed ever more insistent instincts and needs of its own, he became more trapped, more tangled up with the demands of the physical self. When the time arrived for teenage parties, he seemed always to be lost, forever walking unfamiliar streets, searching for houses full of young people that he didn't really want to be with, in order to have embarrassed, unfulfilled encounters of an inexpertly sexual nature that merely left him confused. At night he didn't always fly now, but spent much anxious time seeing boats he was meant to be on leaving harbours and buses he had to catch pulling away from stops just before he got there. Or he was frantically running through impossible Pyrenean labyrinths of tunnels and platforms and escalators to get trains he always missed. The confusion and disconnection only worsened when the mating imperative took full charge of members and emotions. There would be long periods of time, sometimes years, when the body was totally in command and indulged itself enthusiastically and frequently. But there would also be substantial intervals when the inner self, the immaterial self, finding the whole business messy and crude, rebelled and denied the body's clamorings, reducing them to quiescence. In the words of the unavoidable cliché, these were Jekyll and Hyde phases, atavistic indulgence alternating with ascetic disgust. Somehow he got a job he didn't want, he got a flat he didn't want, he got a wife he didn't want. No, that's not fair. He got a wife whose inner self he knew and loved, but whose constant presence made him feel even more earthbound, even more trapped. Anyone's constant presence would have made him feel that way. It had nothing to do with the individual. He was, of course, no good at being married. It wouldn't last. He continued to fly at night, but less and less as the years passed, and more fitfully, increasingly unable to remain aloft for more than the very briefest of flights. The complete freedom of flight that his nightlife had brought for so long was gradually replaced by episodes of claustrophobic entrapment. And when he did fly, it was no longer through gorgeous abstract infinitudes, but in defined spaces with ceiling and walls that hemmed him in, and with people on the ground who were forever shouting up to him that he must come down and be with them, be like them. But more often now, instead of flying, he would be wandering aimlessly through the huge rooms and corridors of a vast multi-storied ruinous house, climbing higher and higher up staircases that grew narrower and narrower until, turning a corner, he became wedged between walls that had grown too close together and was stuck fast, unable to go forward or back. Then at last the night flights stopped altogether. The material world had caught him. The relentless demands of that material world hedged him about in daylight and darkness. Body and brain went about their repetitive mundane tasks, working, eating, socializing, sleeping, etc. ad nauseam, while the undernourished spirit remained trapped in that narrow stone staircase, unable to escape the solid stonework, unable to escape the solid world. The inner self came to dread the night world, held fast in the flightless dark, watching powerlessly as images of anxiety and panic swarmed and trooped, endlessly mocking through the long dark hours. His teeth crumbled and filled his mouth with bone dust, or they became so loose that he must spit them out. They grew too large for his mouth, causing his jaws to snag on each other and lock together so that he could neither speak nor eat. Fillings fell out en masse, leaving him with a mouthful of snaggly stumps. His hair came out in great clumps when brushed and combed. It hung loosely about his head, growing on a wide flap of skin which was only attached to his skull at the back of his head. This flap constantly lifted up as though caught by a puff of wind, to reveal the raw-boned dome of the top of his skull. Awake and asleep, he was trapped. If he was going to survive in any fashion at all, he must reclaim freedom for the inner him. For that to be possible, he must do two things. The first was to keep the bodily self as much as possible away from other people. This would enable him to do the second thing. By giving more and more time to entering the abstract world of music or burrowing into the wordscapes of stories and novels which replicated the conditions of his nightlife, he would help the spirit self to wander uninhibited again through long-denied regions of imagination. While he remained imprisoned in the material world, it was only in imagination that the inner self could be free. How was he to recover the absolute freedom that life had taken from him? But these would be invaluable steps towards complete emancipation. He must disengage. He must remove the physical self from the cage of actions and appetites. He must withdraw all presence, all impact of the material self from its surroundings. He must tread lightly He must make no noise, cause no disturbance, make no impression at all in the day world. He must efface that self so thoroughly that it became weightless, invisible. As a child, he had fallen under the spell of the hunting of the snark. One line about the fate of the baker had fascinated him more than all the rest. It still did. He had softly and suddenly vanished away. Ever since then, that had been what he most wanted to do. And now he must set about making it possible more determinedly than ever before. He stopped going to work. He stopped going out socially. As firmly but kindly as he could, he purged his life of others. He removed himself from social media and deleted his email account. No one had phoned him other than commercially or opportunistically for so long that throwing his mobile phone into the moor of a garbage truck was almost redundant, but it felt good. He cancelled all deliveries of food and drink and essentials. He went out for walks only after dark, and even then to places where others would not be walking at night. Hills and woodlands and hidden pathways were his only companion. Hills and woodlands and hidden pathways where his only company was nestling, scampering, and snuffling things that set branches and undergrowth rustling. These nocturnal adventurings also worked their magic on his sleep world. He started to fly again, and to fly in a way he hadn't since childhood. There were no more confining ceilings and walls. A mere lift of the heels, the simple wish to fly, sent him soaring effortlessly up and up to impossible heights in limitless space, where he drifted or dived or spun as the whim took him, sometimes hovering with the millimetre precision of a hummingbird, sometimes dropping into the bullet-like plunge of a falcon. The sheer sensual joy he got from the freedom of flight was 1,000 times more vivid than anything he experienced by day, just as it had been when he was young. This was how it used to be. His night life was once more his true life. As his night self grew stronger, more vibrant, his day self dwindled, lost substance, grew even fainter in the margins of the book. Real life was such a brittle thing, too noisy, too clamorous, and too fragile. When he did occasionally have to go out in daylight, he seemed to have become all but invisible, immaterial. He trod so softly that he scarcely touched the ground. He displaced no air. He made no sound. He almost felt he might be able to walk through walls. Much of the time he had the feeling that he was walking through people, and they through him. But of course he was still present. He could still be seen by people who saw. Then one day, "John! John!" He was vaguely aware of the voice, but didn't connect it with himself. Had he looked back, he would have seen the eager face of an old school friend. His best friend at school, in fact. But he kept on walking, barely making contact with the pavement. As he approached a corner, his old friend, who had broken into a jog to catch up with him, got within a few yards of him. "John!" Turning the corner, still oblivious to the shouting of his name, a strange sensation filled him, as though he were being gently inflated with helium. He became very light-headed, light-bodied, and his feet seemed to lift together off the pavement. He felt blissfully giddy, and for a few seconds completely forgot where he was. Some moments later, his friend also turned the corner. He was confronted with a completely empty side street with no doors or alleyways, just the high, blank sides of 2 department stores. He nearly tripped over something and looked down. There was a heap of evacuated clothes, a pair of shoes, and a satchel lying on the pavement. High, high above him, coming from an ever more distant somewhere in the blue infinity overhead, he heard the unmistakable sound of laughter.